All right, hello everybody, and welcome to my Rainbow Lakes hike. This was a fairly late season hike for me, and so I shot this with the gimbal, and this might actually have been the first video I shot with the gimbal. I think it was, and also with the Rokinon 14mm. So everything's going to be really super wide in this video. The Rainbow Lakes hike is it's a tough moderate. I was not expecting it to be quite as hard as it was, given that it's not a super long hike. But here, what you can see coming out of the parking area, this isn't so bad. And getting up to the first lake, not all that tough. The first lake also is the least exciting of them. The second is a close second least exciting of them. They just keep getting better and better as the lakes keep coming. So this was just a significantly harder hike than I really expected it to be, but definitely a lot of fun for it. I think this is rated a moderate on all trails. That sounds right. I feel like this is a tough moderate, especially past the first lake. Now, it's all in trees, so if you like shaded hikes like I do, walking through a forest is one of my favorite things. Photographing in a forest is one of my least favorite things. So that's why there's a lot of video work here and not a whole lot of still imagery. So walking through a forest is peaceful. It's wonderful. It doesn't get too hot, not so likely to get sunburned. The only downside is Rainbow Lakes has tons of mosquitoes, and I had forgotten just how much I hate mosquitoes and just how big the hives are that they leave on my arms. So that was the only downside. Realistically, this was a really lovely location and a really enjoyable and challenging hike. The lakes themselves are stunning. And okay, the first and second lakes are far from stunning. They're boring. You can skip the first two lakes and you have missed nothing whatsoever on this hike. The uppermost lakes are stunning, and the water in the uppermost lakes is very clear and it reflects really well, and we'll get to see those in a bit. In addition to the lakes, this hike has a whole lot of water crossings and cascades, and in just a moment we're going to get to listen for an extended period to what some of those cascades sound like. It is I know that I've said this already in this video, it's a very peaceful hike, very peaceful setting. And getting up past the first lake, which we, at this point in the video, by the way, we have not reached the first lake. We're still going up there. But getting past it, there were fewer people. No people. This is a really, really popular location, but fewer. So the hike increases in elevation, it increases in difficulty, and accordingly, as is the case with hikes, the number of people decreases. So the forest is mostly this alpine type coniferous forest, which is a big part of why it is that the water in the lakes is so incredibly clear. And eventually, by the way, this is the Indian Peaks Wilderness that we're going to be heading into. And even though you have to park at the Brainard Lake Recreation Area, which has a $12 parking fee, at least in 2020 it did, double check the parking fee before you go to make sure you have cash for it, because they do not take credit cards. There's no cell service there. So, after leaving the Brainard Lake Recreation Area, then the hike just goes up. And I'm going to let the water do the talking, and I'm going to take a minute and go refill my scotch glass. So I want to point out those two still images that the Cascades gave way to. In the first one, the water was frozen, and in the second one, the water was blurry. It was a long exposure. Huge air quotes on that long exposure, because it wasn't. It was a long exposure simulation. There's going to be a lot of that technique in this video, and I'll talk about how I did it and some best practices at the end of this video when I go over all of the stills. That's where most of them are parked from this hike, because I'm recording this so long after I did the hike, I couldn't remember where I took most of the photos. So at any rate, next year I will not be leaving all of the videos to edit at once during the winter. I will try my best to be better about editing them throughout the year. Anyway, it's not even hiking season yet here. I'm recording this in March, and it's just got snow. I can't do anything, and anyway, it feels like December. We were up in Breckenridge this past weekend, and there was tons of fresh snow, and it was icy, and it did not feel like March. There was tons of skiing. The skiing looked like it was wonderful. Anyway, back to the hike. So Rainbow Lakes is a really lovely area outside of the Brainard Lake Rec Area. We talked about the parking fee. You got to make sure you know what that is before you go there. And also, it doesn't matter what day of the week you go if you're going in the summer, probably, or the winter. It's a very popular area. Get there early. The day that I did this hike, I got to the rec area at 6:30 in the morning, and I was taking one of the last spots in one of the last parking lots, and it was Tuesday. So really incredibly packed recreation area in the summers here. When I went back later in the season to hike up to Blue Lake, I think that it's Blue Lake that I already did that video some months ago. But when I went back, I ended up parking in almost the exact same spot, with only a handful, couple dozen additional spots being open on that hike. And I got there only half an hour later on a Wednesday. I think it was a Wednesday. Anyway, this part of the video here, we're at the first Rainbow Lake. So as you can see, I mean, it's pretty, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not the stunning lake that we're going to see later in the video. The further, the lower in elevation that you are, I should say, let me word it that way, the less clean the water in the lakes is going to be. So if you really want to get those stunning colors, like you can see here, all of the silt in the bottom of the lake. If I had fallen in, thankfully I didn't, or almost did a couple times, but I didn't. If I'd fallen in, or if I tossed a rock into it, it would have made all of the silt come up in the water, and it really would have clouded the water. And in fact, when I stepped on a log, it did kind of cloud the water up a little bit for a time. So I did not mean to step on the log. I lost my balance, and it was the log or the water. So at any rate, the lower in elevation that the lake sits, the less clean, as a general rule, the water tends to be. Now, this is really clean here because there's not a whole lot of energy built up into the water, and the silt and sediment had really settled down to the bottom. But in places where like a crawdad or a frog or whatever it was, or a fish would swim away from me as I walked around it, then I would get a pretty good view of sediment being stirred up. So it's something to think about if you are interested in alpine photography, is what is around the lake as well as what's in the lake. So now in that shot, you could see really good reflections of the trees. And in that shot, I would argue that the silt and the sediment kind of helped it because it gave the water a darker color, which made it more reflective. That said, as a matter of personal preference when photographing alpine lakes, I tend to like clearer water that really, there are reflections, but they're not just mirrors. They also show through the colors of the rocks underneath the water as well as the surroundings. So you can see here in this very sped up clip the transition between the rocks in the foreground and the reflection in the background. And there's that area where you can see the rocks coming through the reflection of the trees. And for me, That is really what I look for in a good alpine lake, where you can see into the depths of the water as well as the reflection around it. And I think that's a good and incredibly strong way to photograph an alpine lake. It's at least aesthetically, it's my favorite. And the reason I like that is because if you can get the colors and the textures of the rocks that are underwater, especially very, very high elevation lakes like Chasm Lake and things like that, which are around 11,000 feet and above tree line, there's no sediment in them. So you just get the rocks and the texture and the water and the reflection of their surroundings, and they all blend together. So you get the reflection with this like underlayment of texture. And so it's sort of like if you were to take a texture and use it as a mask on an image. And to my aesthetic sensibility, that gives the reflection a better sense of place and of location, because it's becoming one with what's underneath the water, as well as showing what is around the water. So that's one of the things I look for in an alpine lake. It is significantly easier to photograph these darker alpine lakes like these, the second one which we just left, the second Rainbow Lake. The first and second Rainbow Lake here, because they are significantly darker because of all the sediment at the bottom that just absorbs any light that makes it that far. And on a nice still day, it just turns them into this really dark, inky black mirror. So significantly easier to capture an image with water that's like that versus water which allows a lot of what's underneath it to be shown through in the reflection. Okay, so I've kind of gone on that quite a bit. We're going to come up here to some more Cascades, but the audio on them was not wonderful, so we'll just stop and take some photos of them. And I don't know why this is oh yeah, this is where my gimbal's batteries started to go really weak. And so quick review of the Zhiyun Weeble S. I think that's the one that I have. It came with these two batteries, and I picked it. It's the smallest one that Zhiyun was making as of 2020. And I picked it because all the reviews were like, yeah, the batteries lasted like 6 hours, and it uses these things called 18650s, which look like overgrown AA's. And so I thought, okay, cool, it comes with really good batteries, I'm not gonna have to worry about it. No, the batteries last for like 90 minutes, 2 hours if I am not, losing my balance all the time. So I don't know who's getting 5 hours out of these batteries. I mean, I know who, because I watched the review, but I don't know how they're getting 5 hours out of these batteries unless they're letting it sit for a time between uses. I certainly wasn't getting 5 hours. Anyway, this is a long exposure simulation here. This one is not. That's just, I wonder if that's as blurry as it looks on my preview in the video editor. I hope not. Yeah, it's just a photo of some wildflowers. That's another one. And that was taken with, that looks like the Yashica 45 that I modified for my camera, but I can't remember for sure now. Anyway, here's some clips of me milling about and taking photos. And we'll see a couple of the photos afterward. So one thing here, if you're going to be out photographing in nature, you shouldn't wear a suit or clothes that can't be washed very easily. Got really dirty at this part in the video, by the way. Did not really come out. Those pants still have some mud stains from this hike in the knees and shins. At any rate, so what I'm doing here is I'm getting the camera and literally doing a long exposure simulation. I don't recall if it turned out or not. And what I did, this is with the Sony a5000, this little camera I was using right now. So I flipped the screen up so I could frame the image as I wanted. I focused, and then I just held down the shutter button and let it do its thing, underrun the buffer over and over and over again for a long period of time until I had 25, 35 photos, something like that. And maybe less. I don't think that was enough time to take 25 photos with the a5000. Anyway, take a bunch of different photos and then blend them together in post. Go over the specific technique of that at the end of this video. point here to make is that when you are doing this, so you might notice I have a camera strap on the camera. I had it wrapped around my wrist here. That's just fine. Wrapping it around your neck is fine. Whatever you do, if you're in a situation like this with a river crossing and you're sticking your camera down literally an inch or less above the water, to the point that I was literally, I think the bottom of the camera was wet after this shot that I'm taking right now. You want to have minimal to no slack in the camera strap when you're using it, so that if your hand slips off the camera, the slack in the camera strap doesn't allow the camera to fall into the water. So when I was shooting this, I had the strap wrapped around my wrist, and I had it literally as tight as I could make it and still be able to hold the camera as I wanted. So that's my tip for today. If you're going to be getting down in the water like that, is just let it, don't let your camera have any slack, lest you risk dropping it in the water. So here are some of the shots that I was taking right now. It looks like I have 4 of them teed up. Here's those same plants. This is a lot better than the first one of those shots from there. That was the second of the 2 shots you saw me taking. This one right here where the bottom of the camera got wet. That might have been from a different Cascade. Doesn't look like it should have been from that one. That is definitely from a different Cascade, because I was using the Camland 50mm for that shot. I remember taking it. Anyway, there were 4 shots, and only 2 of them were related to that little clip. So after those Cascades, the trail continues to get harder, and it gets narrower. It's a little bit harder to follow it, and then it gets pretty rocky. This was a little side area that I thought was the trail. Looks like it wasn't really. There were some people having lunch, I guess, up here. I don't know, or a romantic interlude, whatever they were doing. Good for them. They were having fun. And so at any rate, that was not the way to go. And doesn't change the fact that the trail continues to get narrower and a little bit harder up here, but it's worth it because this is the end of the trail. And in roughly, looking at the timestamps here, 2 minutes, that looks about right. We're going to be at the upper Rainbow Lakes, of which there are 3 or 4. Now there are 7 Rainbow Lakes, but I want to say only 5 of them are accessible by the trail. I feel like 2 of them you can see, but you can't get down to. So that means that there are, in fact, I think 3 of them up here. That sounds right. Or maybe there's 3 you can't get to. Anyway, you can't get to all of them, but the ones you can get to are definitely worth visiting. And these ones up here at the very top are stunningly, stunningly beautiful. They are the best of the hike, and definitely worth making it if you're out here. So the end of the hike is this big boulder climb. Or walk. The boulders look bigger than they actually are because this is a 14mm lens. So you basically just need to take big steps up them like some sort of uncoordinated and poorly assembled staircase. And then this is the second to top lake that we're looking at right now. Off to the right side of the camera, there's another lake that feeds into that lake on the left through a small little cascade. We'll see some photos of that. It was a really interesting place to get out to and photograph. I got to say, this was basically the perfect time to arrive. It was lunchtime. I think it was 11:30, give or take, and you can see the clouds there were just perfect. One of the things I really look for when photographing alpine lakes is partly cloudy skies. If you have fully cloudy skies, or mostly you can work with, but if you have fully cloudy skies, you get terrible reflections on the lake. But if you have partly cloudy skies like this, which is perfect, you have a nice gradation in the blue of the skies. And if you take a long exposure, you also have cloud movement. Up at elevation, the clouds move much more quickly because of the wind patterns, and also are perceived to move more quickly because you're closer to them. In the same way that if you're riding in a train, the corn nearer the train car seems to move significantly more quickly than the corn way out in the field. At any rate, this is perfect cloud trail weather for alpine lakes because you can get blurry motion in the clouds without tons of effort and without a super long exposure. You don't need an ND 6 trillion filter to get a nice cloud trail here. You can do it with a burst of shots. So a bunch of the shots you're going to see in just about 5 seconds are long exposure simulations. Now, why camera makers don't include this mode in their camera to just do it in RAW, I don't know. You can kind of do this with multiple exposures, and Pentax does give you the ability to do this in their cameras, but I was only shooting Sony on this hike. It is immensely frustrating that every camera maker should allow you in camera to simulate long exposures, but they don't. It'd be nice to just get a single RAW file back instead of having to deal with 85 of them in post. So the technique for long exposures is to set your ISO at the lowest you can. And then once you've done that, set your aperture to something that's not going to give you diffraction softness. So like an f8, f11 at most, and that will give you a reasonably long exposure. You can see here this at work. And then you just take as many as you can before you underrun your buffer. If you have no clouds in the shot, you can underrun your buffer till you're blue in the face and just take photos of the water and keep blurring it. If you have clouds in the shot, you have to stop when you underrun your buffer, or you won't have, or what you'll get is you'll get this jigsaw-like look in the clouds, or you'll get breaks in them, and that's not a good look for this simulation technique. So once you have the RAW files edited into your liking, what you're going to do is open them up in your post processor. I use Photoshop CS6 extended, and then I blur. If you're using CS6 or earlier, you need the extended version for this. And then you use statistics set to mean to blur all of the images together. If you're hand holding your camera or setting it on a rock and don't have a tripod, then you just need to auto align all of your images before doing the statistics operation. One of the downsides to this technique is if you look in the water, these are still really fast shutter speeds. Like here's a perfect example of what it can look like. It doesn't look smooth, it looks textured because the shutter speeds are all like 1/250th, 1/125th, sometimes faster. And so you're not actually getting a single long shutter speed, you're getting tons and tons of very short ones. And the result of that is you don't get smooth water, you get textured water that looks smooth. Now, even worse is if you have a sensor that scans multiple times per exposure, even on the fast shutter speeds, you're going to have basically what looks like, if you have like a drop flying across the frame, you might get that 4 times in one exposure. And so that's going to amplify that jagged look of the water. So with long exposure simulation, you really, really want to get as slow a shutter speed as you can. And to that end, honestly, a CPL is gonna help you. I don't carry filters, but on this hike, I think realistically a lot of my long exposure simulation shots would have looked a lot better if I'd had a CPL, or an ND4 even would have been just fine to slow down my shutter a bit. So that is the Rainbow Lakes hike and how I did some of the photos that I took. And I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video and got some greater understanding about how to take some of the photos that you see in very many of my videos. Take care. I'll see you in the next video.